Chapter 4. The spindle is even more dangerous when turned against oneself, because then it does not come outside and cannot be caught. Seemingly it does not cause trouble, but it destroys the woman herself. Frequently one comes across women who say, "Well, you see, I somehow assumed that I should never get married," or "I was stupid, for I never managed to do anything in life." One asks, "Why did you assume that?" God knows. In early youth, such a self-destructive conviction was arrived at and never discussed with anybody or expressed in any way. From then on, the whole inner development with the possibilities of creating or of becoming something or somebody vanishes, just as Briar Rose vanished after pricking herself. You can only see that something has stopped in such people. They seem asleep and move along under a dark fate. One does not know why. Everything has stagnated. Generally, they do not talk about it, for they themselves do not realize it. Speaking of it to the analyst would imply that there was a problem about which they had doubts. But if they are really in a bewitched sleep, they are not being dishonest. It simply never occurs to them that there is anything to discuss. Such women simply fall out of life one day, just as happens in the fairy tale. Perhaps it is the negative mother complex, or perhaps the mother's animus. The old woman in the story is a kind of mother figure or grandmother, and the spindle would stand for the mother's animus. I remember the case of a pronounced psychological illness of a woman who could not digest anything and had to take all food in the form of pills. Half starved, she came to analysis because her doctor had finally come to the conclusion that her illness must be psychological. The woman's mother had been a nurse in the hospital and had lived the Christian, self-sacrificing attitude of considering her life valueless and wanting nothing from it. Life should be given to the service of others. And with this went a suicidal tendency, a real problem with many nurses in hospitals. Although this self-sacrificing attitude did not stop her from catching the head doctor of the hospital. After marriage, her animus came up again, and she would moan to her husband and children that she should not have married or had children, but should have remained a nurse. So the children grew up in an atmosphere in which the mother's animus informed them from morning to evening that their existence was a mistake, that it was a wrong idea for them to be alive. The daughter gave into whatever was asked of her, since she felt she had to propitiate her surroundings. She was frightened of everyone, her basic attitude being that she had no right to be alive. "But please do not kill me, and I will do anything you want." She had been pricked by the deadly spindle of her mother's animus opinion, which she herself had also adopted, namely that she should not be alive. She was just another Briar Rose, stung by the mother's negative animus, and did not know it. The strange thing was that when she first came into analysis, I felt as if something had been put over my head and I was falling to sleep. I always let myself go into such fantasies when I get an impression from an analysand. My feeling in this case was that I should get up and put my head under the cold water tap. There was quite a pleasant atmosphere, for she was like a little duckling in my hands and never contradicted or opposed me in any way. She interested me, and I felt sympathetic and yet had this sleepiness which depicted her own situation. She had not woken up to the fact that she had the right to live. For years the analysis consisted in showing her and all the events of her life where she had, unconsciously, continually given in. We always came back to the same thing, but she had fallen into an abyss of unhappiness and was completely unable to digest anything. To digest is to react, but this woman had no reaction to what happened to her. In a broader collective sense, the same motif would mean that certain factors in feminine psychic life have been devalued by some unconscious reflection. In our civilization, one of the most widespread unconscious reflections, perhaps not unconscious, but still at the back of people's minds, is an association between evil and woman. In the story of the Garden of Eden, Adam told God that Eve was responsible. She had talked to the devil. Over and over you come across that negative connection and the identification of evil with the woman's problem. Men with a negative mother complex do it frequently. Since our civilization is mainly patriarchal, such a thought is at the back of the minds of many people. A high-ranking Catholic priest once said to me, "Why is there always this problem with women?" His remarks were quite justified because, once again, a hysterical woman had tried to seduce him in the confessional and had behaved disgustingly. Such women afterward go around saying that the priest had tried to seduce them. A priest wears a robe which proclaims his desire to have nothing to do with women. That irritates certain women who make up their minds to seduce him. They are irritated by the women's dress. Naturally, seen from the priest's standpoint, it is disgusting to be always surrounded by hysterical women. There is no love in it. It's just a power drive, and of course, the man says, "My God, women." But what he does not see is that by wearing a robe and being representative of a patriarchal order with a pope at the head, but no female counterpart, there is a kind of declaration of war against the feminine element. It is a very ticklish problem because it calls forth this reaction in women. Of course, it is very unreasonable, but behind it is the question, why do we have no priestesses? In 3 cases, the dreams of women who misbehaved in this way have said that there should be priestesses, which shows they felt insulted. In many primitive civilizations, both sexes are represented in the religious ceremonies, and women can attain higher ranks as religious guides. In actual fact, the Catholic Church is not as bad as it is theoretically, for there are many women who assume the role of the priest through the spirit of their personality, then men give into it. Superiors in convents were of course such priestesses, though they did not have the title, they had the role. Saint Teresa of Avila is a striking example. But the basic problem comes from the more patriarchal attitude. Women who do not take the trouble to think about such things get a hidden feeling of inferiority that they compensate by being disagreeable and so attracting attention. If one cannot attract men's love, then one must provoke their anger. At least the priest must think about one whether he likes it or not. When the prince appears after 100 years, the thorny hedge growing around the castle blossoms suddenly into beautiful roses. The rose, says one medieval author, belongs to the goddess of Venus and means love, for there is no love without thorns. They also say, ubi mal ibi fal. Where there is honey, there is also the bitter gall. You can refer the meaning of the thorn to the terrible involuntary hurts loving people always inflict upon each other. There is the expression, a typical lover's quarrel. We would call it an anima-animus quarrel, the sword crossing of animus and anima, which consists in the most horrible way of hurting each other in the most vulnerable spots. Just where the man has a most uncertain, delicate feeling, the woman places the thorn of her animus, and where the woman wants to be understood or accepted, the man comes out with some anima poison dart. Such hedges of thorns in dreams refer to exaggerated touchiness, which is always combined with aggressiveness. If a very touchy animalizan comes, I know that I shall get a lot of very bad stings, so I put on an armor. Touchy people are proud of their sensitiveness, by which they tyrannize other people. An unkind word provides tragedy for months. You cannot open your mouth because you might hurt the other person. They get into tempers over everything and sulk and are hurt in their wonderful, delicate feelings. It is just plain tyranny. Such people usually have a very vulgar hidden power complex which comes out in the shadow, an infantile attitude toward life through which those around us are tyrannized. What should be a receptive, loving attitude becomes a thorny hedge, where every man who tries to penetrate gets so torn that he just retires. A man cannot get at such a touchy woman who is hurt by the most harmless remark. It is too complicated, and naturally he gives up, like the men in the fairy tale. The solution in this story is strange, for there is no merit, no dramatic event anywhere. The situation just changes after 100 years. The prince comes, but does not do anything special. He just goes through at the right time. Several conclusions can be reached. One could say this illustrates that the problem of touchy domination has to be treated with patience and waiting. If you try to get through and show such a touchy person that she is a tyrant, you generally get just kicked into the thorny hedge and entangle yourself, and the relationship goes to pieces. I have often failed in such cases, and the patient has walked out deeply hurt that I dared to touch that problem and misunderstand it as domination, when really it was the great delicacy of an incredibly delicate soul. The only thing to do is not to attack the problem directly, but to wait until people are so lonely in their power complex that they are at the end of their rope. The passivity of the prince shows that the collective images of the fairy tales recommend such an attitude. There are situations which belong to the feminine principle, that is, the anima of man and the feminine in woman herself, where time is the essential thing. Nothing else can help and all interference is wrong. We can take, for example, the anima problem. Certain men with a positive mother complex marry late, because they become the type of oversensitive literary bachelor with a very delicate flower-like anima, and they're so touchy and oversensitive that they never know how to go out and get a woman. They are imprisoned in their own sensitivity. If a kind of vital physical drive does not force them, they stay outside marriage and the woman's problem for too long. But often such people suddenly wake up without analysis. I have seen this happen at 30, 36, or 40. They just leave their touchy cage and marry happily. And the thing goes quite well, without analysis. It is just as though they at first waited too long, but then caught up. It is like a delayed or late development due to their delicacy or sensitiveness. Analysis would not help such people. They just had to sleep and then wake up. Sometimes the best thing to do with such a bachelor type is to send him away and say he's okay. He should just wait until he finds a woman who suits him. One day he will wake up. He has been under the veil of a too delicate feeling side, which has developed in the positive relationship with the mother. With women who have the idea that they have no right to exist, the same thing happens. Under the influence of such thoughts, they give in to everybody and then suddenly wake up without becoming conscious. The phase of sleep has come to an end. I remember a friend much older than I, a very delicate, sensitive, quiet woman who first came under the tyranny of her stepmother and then of her elder sister, who thought she would replace the mother. This poor woman did what she was told. They had no money, and she went to work and behaved. The only thing one could say was that she was rather boring, and one felt that she should not be. Suddenly, at the age of 43, she woke up and married and had a child and developed slowly into a lively and interesting woman. When the 100 years were over, her life began to constellate. One would not get far by analyzing such a person. There are many cases, especially among sensitive people, who developed better without the interfering operation of an analytical treatment, which sometimes only gets them out of their inner rhythm. If taken on a personal level, the story of Briar Rose is that of a negative mother complex in a woman, and also of a man's negative mother complex when his anima goes to sleep. Now let us look at the counterpart, the pattern of a positive mother complex, of which this story is an example. Snow White and Rose Red. Synopsis of the tale. There was once a poor widow who lived alone in her cottage with her 2 children, who, because they were like the flowers blooming on the rose bushes which grew before the house, were called Snow White and Rose Red. Rose Red was the more lovely and more extroverted of the 2, and Snow White was the quieter. They were good girls and always did what their mother told them. The story is very long and sentimental, which is very typical of the positive mother complex. There is an effort to describe a wonderful atmosphere. The little girls never quarrel, are obedient, and lead a wonderful life and help their mother, etc. They sometimes do risky things, such as going into the woods and playing too long and forgetting to come home, and then falling asleep under a tree close to the edge of a pit, into which they would have fallen had they walked a couple of steps further in the dark. But according to their mother, an angel had watched over them, so all was well. One evening, while they sat spinning at the hearth, there was a knock at the door, which Rose Red opened, and there appeared a bear. After some flutterings and bleatings by a dove and a lamb which live in the house with them, they let the bear in, since he said he did not want to harm them, but was half frozen and wished to come in and warm himself. "Poor bear," said the mother. "Come in and lay down before the fire, but take care you do not burn your skin." So the bear came in and told the children to knock the snow off his coat, and then grumbled out his satisfaction and laid down before the fire and stayed the whole winter. The girls played with the unwieldy animal, pulled his long, shaggy skin, stood on him, and rolled him to and fro, and even beat him with a hazel stick. He bore it all good-naturedly, but if they hit too hard, he cried out. Leave me my life, you children, Snow White and Rose Red, or you'll never wed. Which was the only indication that he had some intention. Otherwise, he behaved like a big, good-natured toy. But as soon as the spring returned, he said he had to go and could not return during the whole summer, for he was obliged to go into the forest and guard his treasures from the evil dwarves, who stay in their holes all the winter but come out in the summer and steal all they can find. Snow White was so sad at his departure and opened the door so hesitatingly that when he pressed against it, he left behind on the latch a piece of his hairy coat. Through the hole made in his coat, Snow White fancied she saw the glittering of gold, but she was not quite sure and thought it must have been a hallucination. One day, when sent into the wood to gather sticks, the two sisters came to a tree, on the trunk of which something kept bobbing up and down. When they got near, they saw a dwarf with an old wrinkled face and a snow-white beard a yard long. The end of the beard was caught in a split in the tree, and the little man kept jumping up like a dog tied by a chain, for he did not know how to free himself. He glared at the girls with his fiery eyes and said, "Why do you stand there? Are you going to pass without offering me any assistance?" "What have you done, little man?" asked Rose Red. "You stupid, inquisitive goose," he exclaimed. "I wanted to split the tree in order to get a little wood for my kitchen, for the little food which we use is soon burned with great faggots, not like what you rough, greedy people devour. I had driven the wedge in properly, and everything was going well until the wedge sprang out suddenly, and the tree closed so quickly that I could not draw my beautiful beard out, and here it sticks, and I cannot get away. There, don't laugh, you milk-faced things. Are you dumbfounded?" The children tried their hardest to pull the dwarf's beard out, but without success. "I will run and fetch some help," cried Rose Red at length. "Crack-brained sheephead that you are," snarled the dwarf. "What are you going to call other people for? You're already too many for me. Can you think of nothing else?" But Snow White said she had thought of something and pulled her scissors out of her pocket and cut off the end of the beard. As soon as he was freed, the dwarf picked up his sack filled with gold, and instead of thanking them, insulted them further and ran off, calling them stupid for having cut off a piece of his beautiful beard. But they did not mind, or were too stupid or innocent to notice anything, and forgot about it. Sometime afterward, Snow White and Rose Red were fishing, and as they neared the pond, they saw something like a great locust hopping about on the bank, as if going to jump into the water. They ran up and recognized the dwarf. "What are you after?" asked Rose Red. "You will fall into the water." "I am not quite such a simpleton as that," replied the dwarf. "But do you not see that this fish will pull me in?" The little man had been sitting there, angling, and unfortunately, the wind had entangled his beard into the fishing line. So when a great fish bit the bait, the strength of the weak little fellow was not sufficient to draw it out, and the fish had the best of the struggle. The dwarf held on to the reeds and rushes which grew near, but to no purpose, for the fish pulled him where he liked, and he must soon have been drawn into the pond. Luckily, just then the two maidens arrived and tried to release the dwarf's beard from the fishing line, but both were too closely entangled for it to be done. So Snow White pulled out her scissors and cut off another piece of the beard. When the dwarf saw this, he was in a great rage and exclaimed, "You donkey! That is the way to disfigure my face. Was it not enough to cut it once? But now you must take away the best part of my fine beard. I dare not show myself again to my own people. I wish you had run the soles off your boots before you had come here." So saying, he took up a bag of pearls, which lay among the rushes, and without speaking another word, slipped off and disappeared behind a stone. Not many days later, the girls were sent to the next town to buy thread, needles and pins, laces and ribbons. On the common, they saw a great bird flying around and then dropping lower and lower until at last it slowed down behind a great rock. Then they heard a piercing shriek, and to their horror saw that the eagle had caught their old acquaintance, the dwarf. The compassionate children thereupon laid hold of the little man and held fast until the bird gave up the struggle and flew off. As soon as the dwarf had recovered from his fright, he began to abuse the girls again, and said that they had torn his beautiful coat by holding him so roughly, although by now they were accustomed to his ingratitude. Coming home, they returned over the same common and, unaware, walked up to a clean spot where the dwarf had shaken out his bag of precious stones and stopped to admire them. "What are you standing there and gaping for?" asked the dwarf, his face growing as red as copper with rage. Suddenly a loud, roaring noise was heard, and a great bear came crashing out of the forest. The dwarf jumped up, terrified, and tried to turn away, but the bear overtook him. Thereupon he cried out, "Spare me, my dear Lord Bear, I will give you all my treasures. See these beautiful precious stones which lie here? Only give me my life. What have you to fear from a little weak fellow like me? You would not even feel me beneath your big teeth. There are 2 wicked girls, take them. They would make you nice tender morsels. They are as fat as young quails, eat them." The bear, however, without troubling himself to speak, gave the bad-hearted dwarf a single blow with his paw, and he never stirred again. The girls were then going to run away, but the bear called after them, "Snow White, Rose Red, fear not. Wait a bit and I will accompany you." They recognized his voice and stopped, and the bear's tough coat suddenly fell off, and he stood up, a tall man dressed entirely in gold. "I am a king's son," he said, "and was condemned by that wicked dwarf, who stole all my treasures, to wander about the forest in the form of a bear till his death released me. Now he has received the punishment he so richly deserved." They went home, and Snow White was married to the prince, and Rose Red to his brother, with whom they shared the immense treasure the dwarf had collected. The old mother lived happily with her 2 children. The rose trees that had stood before the cottage were planted now before the palace, and every year produced beautiful red and white roses. The beginning of the story is characterized by a kind of innocent childhood paradisical situation, the mother-daughter paradise. Everything is alright, but a little bit too beautiful. It would be marvelous if it were like that. There are 3 persons, so from our point of view it is incomplete. From the average statistical viewpoint, 4 is the usual number of the totality, and here there are only 3. The 4th thing soon appears as the bear. So, in the winter time there are 4, 3 women and a bear. But in the beginning the male element is completely lacking. There is no father, for he has died. It is the feminine atmosphere which is described as ideal. As long as the children are young, it is alright. But they live so isolated a life that they never see a man. They are out of life. If you apply this to a collective situation, you can say that the masculine and the feminine world are not in the right connection, so to speak, on the human as well as on the spiritual level. One of the ways in which the feminine world defends and establishes itself in its own right is by creating a feminine paradise. You see this sometimes in women's clubs, where the women sit together and talk about their little concerns, ignoring or excluding the man's world. You can see it also in families, where the mother and daughters get together and play among themselves, scorning the father and brothers a little, saying that men must get out of the kitchen. Men are big babies or fools. In the same way that men have clubs to reinforce their self-esteem and role in society, there is no reason why women should not have a parallel in which they can assert their femininity in their own right, and realize their differences from men and their different needs. There are primitive tribes where young men are initiated into men's secret societies and young women into women's secret societies. The men learn their certain men's arts, such as speaking in council and the use of weapons, and the women learn weaving and certain feminine arts and are instructed in feminine adult behavior and love magic. In Greece, there was a cult of the goddess Artemis of Brorin, who was a bear goddess. Young girls of good families were given to serve the goddess from their 12th to 16th year. In the awkward time when girls are just as difficult to keep at home as boys, they were given into the service of the goddess. They behaved like tomboys, neither washed nor cared for themselves in any way, spoke roughly, and were called bear cubs. Thus, the bear cub societies of the mother goddess served to reinforce the feminine under the veil of protection. In this way, the feminine personality could develop unharmed by the problem of sexuality and go into life with a certain amount of maturity, gained in security under the bearskin. Otherwise, often only half-developed girls would fall into sexual life and at 30 would be old and worn out. Naturally, such women cannot develop anymore mentally, for the vital substance is exhausted. They are just tired old women. Particularly if girls have a rather delicate feminine nature underneath, do they hide it behind tomboy manners. I taught boys and girls of that age for a long time and observed that the girls who wore such bearskins were much more alert and interested in school, and that their marks went down as soon as they started a love life, dating boys, and became more interested in love. Those to whom this happened later had a better chance of developing a certain amount of personality than those who went into the other side too early. If the feminine group clings together and makes a certain hedge against the masculine principle, it is not eo ipso, always negative, but rather reinforces the feminine so that the two can meet on a better level later on. One must not forget that there is not only the great attraction of the sexes, but they are genuine opposites which have always threatened each other, the women pulling the men into their feminine ways and vice versa. That forms a kind of constant tension between men and women which is not abnormal. The otherness makes the attraction. In our society, women were more concerned with their neighbors, with births, deaths, and marriages, with the personal things. It is their task to create the atmosphere of connectedness between those near at hand, while the men must know of what is happening outside and take measures to meet the world. One meets with this in Chinese philosophy too. In chapter 20 of the I Ching, you will find that to look through the crack of the door is right for a woman but harmful for a man. To look at things narrowly or intimately is not shameful for a woman, for that is her natural outlook. But a man should have wider and more objective interests and look at things from a wider angle. In China, therefore, there is the same distribution of areas of interests. And only feminine world lacks the breadth of horizon. It is too narrow and personal if not in contact with the masculine principle. Everybody knows what happens if you have flocks of women together, girls, schools, and homes for nurses. One thinks of the enormous tower which was built in Zurich for nurses, only for female nurses. Think of the atmosphere in girls' schools where the girls congregate together and discuss the teacher's tie, etc. The story illustrates the feminine scene, innocent and charming in its own way, but it lacks the other side. The woman with a positive mother complex naturally tends to have self-assurance and those personal interests her mother had, but also, naturally, there are the dangers and disadvantages. Here there is a normal development. On winter's day the bear, the fourth element, walks in. We should therefore look at the symbolism of the bear. I have been told that if you skin a bear and hang it up in the butcher's shop, which is something people used to be able to see, it looks exactly like a clumsy human being. This simple fact may account for the projection that bears are bewitched or cursed human beings. Everywhere in folklore, the bear tends to be the bewitched prince, or the man who has been cursed to walk about in a bearskin. Among the followers of Wotan there was the berserks. To go berserk was thought to be a gift in certain families. If a battle was taking place and the duke or the count sat at home, suddenly he would give a terrific yawn and then fall into a death-like sleep. While on the battlefield there appeared a bear who killed everybody. After a while the bear disappeared and the duke woke up and was very tired. He had gone berserk, and in the form of an exteriorized soul, a bear's soul, had fought the battle. These berserks were looked on as the ghost of bears who did great deeds, and the proof that it was really the duke himself was that the bear was wounded in the right paw, and the man, when he woke up at home, was wounded in his right hand. In olden times in Germany, this was looked upon as a positive quality inherited in certain families. But later this changed, and now to go berserk has a negative implication and means to be capable of getting into a great rage which touches on an ecstatic religious experience. That is why many people do not want to give in to their fits of rage. When one is in a rage, one feels possessed by the plenitude of life. One has a feeling of completeness and of being one with one's own purpose. One has no further doubts or uncertainties, and one feels warmed through. It is like a stove on a cold winter's day. One can work oneself into a feeling of being fully and marvelously alive and afterwards say, "I told them." Waking up from the ecstasy and paying the bill is less pleasant. Then one feels less divine and a bit awkward. It is only in anger that we really know what anyone thinks of us. Only in anger do we give voice to our true opinions. Giving up the capacity for expressing one's rage is as hard as giving up any other neurotic symptom, for people are often in love with their berserk quality and won't give it up in order to become sober and reasonable. The idea of holy wrath was even admitted in Christianity, where it was permitted, for instance in the Crusades, where one fought for Christ, or for the priest who might work himself into a holy rage in the fight against sin and wickedness. That, of course, is an excuse to continue the berserk rage. Rage is just barbaric, but it still exists in us all. And if the nation is unjustly attacked, the whole nation will rise up in a so-called holy rage. Should one get into such a rage if one is seriously attacked? Are there times in life when this is justifiable? The question is connected with your deepest outlook on life. Has a person the right to defend himself in certain crucial moments? From the Christian standpoint, it is generally not permissible, since Christians should be only good. But it is another question when it comes to fighting Nazism and the like. There one comes to a place where it is a question of religious conviction. One has to make up one's mind and stand by that. Our decision will depend on the image we have of God. If we believe that God is only good, it is clear that we should be only good. But if we think of a black as well as a white side of God, then the blackness has its meaning too. That might mean that one had the right, that it is instinctively right to use claws and teeth if really unjustly attacked. A son devoured by his mother may be a decent fellow who tries to be reasonable and says that he is a grown-up and wants to go out with a girl and have a flat of his own. But the mother won't give in, even though the son suggests that she should see his analyst, which she refuses to do. She does all she can to destroy him. Has he not the right to say that he intends to walk out? She will call him cruel and wicked, but the onlooker will see that it is a matter of life and death for the son, who has the right to be harsh. It is not necessary for him to go berserk, but in the innermost corner of the personality, something rises up and the fight is necessary. If people have no conviction of their right to live, you can get them nowhere in analysis. There is such a thing as having the right to defend oneself, and to fight not to be overthrown by the animus of the mother or some other wickedness in the surroundings, and those who cannot do it are really sick. Christ himself was not so lamb-like as some people like to pretend. There are indications of this, such as the fact that he brought a sword and that the sin against the Holy Ghost was not forgiven. A world in which nothing on the harsh side is ever allowed is not on the side of life. And here we come to a typically feminine problem. The more feminine a woman is and the less aggressive her animus, the more she will tend to be overrun by her surroundings. You probably know such gentle daughters in families who have always done what father and mother wanted and who do not marry. They nursed their parents until they died and then took care of other people's children. If they tried to get married, all the family was against it, saying that they could not be spared. Such women, with their gentleness and femininity, are just killed, run over by a truck, and they are the fools. In modern life, this is not so frequent, for the poison of being aggressive has gone into women, but formerly there were many women of this nature. In Berlin, one used to speak of Tante Ansprung, the aunt ready to jump in and help. She was an institution in practically all families, to be phoned when anybody was ill, and to be at everybody's beck and call. The poor old maid, just called upon whenever wanted, and whom everybody looked down upon while making use of her. Though it is a great thing for a woman not to be aggressive, she can be too one-sidedly feminine, and then she is out of life and will not be able to cope with it. The one-sided femininely world where everything is so gentle and rosy and nobody quarrels needs the bear. He comes in wintertime and is a good-natured animal, but later, when he catches the dwarf, he kills it with one blow of his paw. Though not a disagreeable animal, he knows they have come to the end of the road and that it is the right time to take action and to put a stop to the dwarf's nonsense. That is the turning point of the story, where the bear instinctively kills the dwarf over whom the girls have been sentimental. So it is the question of integrating the masculine side into the feminine world without going a step too far. And that is a great problem. A woman who wakes up after being too passive, too feminine, faces the possibility of being too aggressive. But no one hits the bullseye the first time. It takes practice. And the fact that she at first shoots wide of the mark accounts for the many typical exaggerations, when too little or too much aggression and insufficient adaptation are replaced by outbursts of affect. The bear illustrates the ideal reaction. He has not been bad-tempered and angry like the dwarf, who worked himself up into a rage and a state of constant irritation. He simply kills his enemy when he meets him, in contrast to the weak, nasty irritation shown by the dwarf. In a woman, the bear and the dwarf would represent two animus figures. The dwarf always reacts in the wrong way, being irritated and irritating those around him. He perpetually creates little quarrels all over the place over any little stupidity, a nail or a louse. These little irritations flame up and everybody gets caught in them. The voice rises or drops and everyone around jumps in. The dwarf does a whole series of idiotic things, catches his beard in the tree and in the fishing line. If a dwarf, who in mythology is supposed to be a good craftsman, does not know how to free his beard and catch a fish without getting entangled, he deserves what he gets. The girls should have laughed at him and left him. So we have a marvelous picture of the annoying and irritating side that a woman's animus can produce. It shows how a grown-up, intelligent woman can entangle herself in such a silly, idiotic quarrel or discussion. The irritated animus loses his sense of humor and is ungrateful and full of power. The dwarf demands that the two girls get him out of his entanglements, and then he shouts at them. His demands on them are annoying, which is also a classic aspect of the negative animus. Everything is formulated from the hidden standpoint of having the right and the need to be served. It is the compensation for the too-yielding feminine nature of Tante Unspring, who is also ready to say yes. The dwarf is an overcompensating figure of the girl's sweetness, who is completely egotistical and ungrateful, and who, in a nasty way, compensates their exaggerated femininity. But the dwarf had to come up. They could not get to the prince without him as an intermediary. The early suffragists inevitably got into such exaggerated attitudes and were over-masculine and egotistical in their demands. One cannot get to the right instinctive balance at once. It has to come by detour and by first suffering the overcompensating attitude. If one makes a study of dwarves, one will find that 90% of their nature is positive. They collect treasures, are wonderful goldsmiths, can weave, make golden goblets, and are great craftsmen. In folklore, children who are blessed by being born on a Sunday go to the dwarf's hill and are given hats which make the wearer invisible, or invisible fetters like silk by which even dragons can be fettered. Always was the one who knew everything in German mythology. The Cabirian Greek and Cretan mythology were the companions of the Great Mother. They were smiths and craftsmen. Thus, dwarves are extremely positive and creative figures. They refer to the creative impulses of the unconscious, so one very rarely comes across destructive dwarves in mythology. Only in the German story Rumpelstiltskin there is a wicked, destructive dwarf who twice tries to steal the child, though he has also helped the miller's daughter to spin gold out of straw. Then he suddenly develops his other side and has to be destroyed. Dwarves have a lot to do with the feminine world and occur more frequently in women's than in men's dream. They often represent the first creative impulses in the unconscious, and some kind of creative activity still hidden in the womb of nature. If a dwarf who is such a great craftsman is very clumsy, as he is in our story, then he is a contradiction in himself and should not exist. He demonstrates an irritating quality which is typical for unlived creativity. If a woman has this hit-the-ceiling irritating animus, it is generally a sign that she really has creative gifts that she has not yet used. The overflow of the creative energy is not rightly employed and therefore gets into destructive mischief and entanglements. Such women have destructive effects, and the cure is in some creative activity in which the dwarf can come into his own and do something where he really does know how to work. Many women who have worked with Jung engage themselves in some kind of creative work, and people sometimes resent this because they think it is something artificial and looks like occupational therapy. But If you look more closely at such situations, you will see that it is not necessarily a case of outer ambition, but what the animus needs to do. If the woman does not help her animus, he goes off and creates mischief. He must have his chance to live. It really means complying with the unconscious needs. The bear gets into a holy rage, which can be negative or positive. Only if one gets into such a rage that it becomes a cold rage is it dangerous, and it can mean murder, for then the climax of the rage has become silent and cold. In Greek, arctos, the word for bear, takes the feminine article. It is the animal of the mother goddess Artemis in Greek mythology, and according to medieval writers is also the animal of the Virgin Mary. In a matriarchal situation, naturally it would be an aspect of the animus and, in general, have a more positive aspect. The bear knows why he acts as he does. There is no trembling or panic of uncertainty. If one knows that this time one's aggression is in the right place, one does not need to shout. The element of rage has been transformed. There is calm, and the rage has been integrated. Usually, when one is in a rage, one feels that it is holy. For subjectively, one feels right, and for this reason, it is very tricky to find out whether it is really right, or one only thinks so. In mythology, the god's rage was not always holy. Think of Ares in the Trojan War, or the goddess Kali in India, who might slaughter a few thousand people and drink blood on the battlefields, or Hathor in Egypt, who goes off into the desert and kills everyone and has to be pacified with beer. Then, when she is drunk, she is peaceful again. In our language, a mythological god is an archetype, and an archetype is always at the same time an instinctive pattern. For the archetype of the mother, the biological basis would be motherhood. For the archetype of the conjunctio, it would be sex. You could refer every god to a biological instinctive dimension. The god represents its meaning or spiritual aspect. One could say that every instinctive dynamism is correlated with an archetypal image. Thus, gods are representations of general complexes. Ares, or Mars, is an image of the instinct of aggression and self-defense in nature. In animal life, self-defense and aggression and fear dominate a whole part of life, and we are not exempt from this. Every archetypal god image is a dynamic, explosive load of psychic energy and humanly uncontrollable. Here, however, that great power is in its right measure. With a powerful stroke of his paw, the bear puts an end to the destructive mischief of the dwarf.